Welcome. We will start shortly. Okay, let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to SMU Tower Center SoundStar webinar series. I'm Hiroki Takeuchi. I'm director of the SoundStar program on Japan and East Asia in the SMU Tower Center. So today I'm delighted to have Dr. Patricia McLachlan of University of Texas at Austin. Before starting today's webinar, first I'd like to thank Bora Lazzi, Jenny Apelti, Leila Fidi, Emma Lansford, Olisa Deras, and Luisa Del Rosal, the whole Tower Center staff. Also, I'm glad to see my colleague of Japanese studies in SMU, Diana Newton and Nico Sternsdorf-Cisterna. I also appreciate the partnership with Japan Metal Society Dallas-Fort Worth. And also on behalf of SMU, I thank Japan Airlines for their support for SMU Tower Center and SMU in Japan program. SMU in Japan program at Kansei Gakuin University. Today, I'm so delighted to introduce my teacher, my senpai, which means my senior colleague, and my friend, Dr. Patty McLachlan. Dr. McLachlan is professor of government and Asian studies and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries professor of Japanese studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She is a leading expert of Japanese politics, particularly political economy of interest groups and reform. Patty and I share the feeling of joy from meeting with people, talking with them, and learning from them. And so she has published two single-authored books. Both are very interesting and important based on her field research. In 2002, she published a book about consumers. And then in 2011, she published a book about post office. Actually, that is my most favorite book. Here is the book. And then, so the title, The People's Post Office, you might think like, what's the matter with the post office? Well, Japanese post office is not just like mailing the letters. But actually Japanese term called yusei, that is usually translated into a postal system, but actually I think it's misleading. I would say it should be translated into postal politics. So she talked about one of the most important interest groups in Japan, postmasters, and then also the whole history of history and politics of Japan's postal office. And she wrote a book of 350 pages. Very interesting one. And today she talks about her new book, which will be published, I think, next year, titled Betting on the Farm, Institutional Change in Japanese Agriculture. And fortunately, I had an opportunity to read the manuscript. So here is a manuscript that I got from Patty. And that was very interesting. It's talking about Japanese agriculture. At the same time, Japanese agricultural cooperative called JA is the most important interest group in Japan, and the politics of JA is very important. So she talked about, she did the field research, very interesting field research that I can see from her whole book, but particularly her, the book's preface is so interesting. And then, so she and her co-author, Kei Shimizu, also our mutual friend, wrote this book. So today, Patty will talk about her book, and then, first, she will talk about, she will give a presentation for 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll move to a Q&A and discussion. So please write in your question or something that you want to discuss on the Q&A box. And then we will discuss it. We'll pick them up and then discuss them after her presentation. So without further ado, please join me for welcoming Dr. Patty McLaughlin.
Thank you so much, Hiroki. That was a really nice introduction. And the part I valued the most was when you referred to me as your friend, which is important to me. And I really enjoy speaking with SMU. I want to thank you and the Tower Center for inviting me tonight, and the Sun and Star program for making this possible. So I'm going to share my screen. So if you'll just give me a moment, I'll pull up my PowerPoint. So I wish we were all in person. It is more fun to do this when we're face to face, but alas, I'm looking forward to everybody's questions. Just a couple of things, as Hiroki noted, this is a book that I completed with Kei Shimizu from the University of Pittsburgh, and I believe Kei Shimizu will be joining us tonight, and I'm very pleased about that, and I hope she will chime in if possible to add to some of the discussion later. So today I want to talk about some of the themes that I bring up in this book, which is we bring up in this book, betting on the farm, institutional change in Japanese agriculture. And although I can't talk about everything, I hope to raise some questions that may provoke some discussion at the end. But for now, I'm going to look at just a slice of this book. And I want to focus on agricultural cooperatives. And we'll start off by talking about what they are and how Japanese co-ops compare to cooperatives in other countries, particularly in the West. So we'll put this in comparative perspective conceptually. And then I want to raise one of the central questions of the book, which is at a time when Japanese agricultural markets are getting more and more competitive and putting more pressure on JA, why is it that some agricultural cooperatives will strive to adapt their strategies to these changing market incentives, while others do not? So what, in other words, explains variations in strategic change amongst these co-ops? And then along the way, I hope to give you all just a snapshot of some of the many challenges and opportunities that are facing the farm sector. And the challenges are largely economic and demographic, but it's not just a story of crisis that I want to tell. I want to tell a story that Kay and I have worked very hard on for many years, and we continue to do so for new projects, of a changing sector that says a lot about not just where agriculture is in Japan, but also globally. And it also, I think, is a lens on broader change within the Japanese economy. So to start, just a brief overview of what JA is. Some of you may know it as Nokyo. It uses the English word Japan Agricultural Cooperatives since the early 1990s. But the structure of it looks very much like it does, with some modification, to the early post-war era. It's a three-tiered network of agricultural cooperative organizations. And at the top is a small group of very powerful organizations, many of them organized by function. And today I'm going to refer mostly to the last one in that first group, Zeno, which provides farm implements, fertilizers, pesticides, seeds, etc., other inputs for farmers. And it also provides distribution and marketing services for the farmer member's product once it has been harvested. At the second level is a number of prefectural chapters that correspond to those national organizations, and they are usually service specific. And then at the bottom of the hierarchy are a number of local cooperatives. And we stop our analysis in 2018 when there were 652 of these multi-purpose co-ops. There are now fewer and fewer of them because of mergers across co-op lines. But this is where the farmer interfaces with the entire JA network. Now, if you look into the literature on agricultural cooperation amongst agricultural economists, you will see the most common definition of a co-op is that put forward by an economist named John Dunn in 1988. He defined it as a user-owned and controlled business from which benefits are derived and distributed on the basis of use, which means co-ops are organizations of co-ops, managed at least to a degree by co-ops, and the benefits by farmers, and the benefits of those co-ops are distributed to those who run the co-op, the farmer. As such, co-ops are usually depicted and should function ideally as democratic economic membership organizations. And in providing services to the co-op members, co-ops should fulfill a number of major objectives. They should minimize or help minimize farmer production and transaction costs. They should help mitigate risk, in part by providing farmers with this nearly guaranteed channel to the market for their produce. They should guarantee a degree of farmer income. And then another major function of the co-op is to represent farmers in the broader marketplace. Farmers on their own have no power over powerful processors or retailers and other actors in the economic system or the food supply chain. But the co-op gives them strength in numbers, both economically and even politically, as we'll see, and that's certainly the case in Japan. I'm only going to talk about that in passing, though. This is a story of the political economics of JA. Now in Japan, we'll see that the co-op network is really internationally very distinctive. For starters, whereas co-ops in most other countries, including this one, practice just one or two sets of functions, in Japan, co-ops provide the whole gamut of possible functions and then some. It is for all intents and purposes a one-stop shop, particularly in rural communities. They are purchasing co-ops, which means they sell those inputs to farmer members. They are marketing co-ops. They sell member product. They also provide credit to farmers. They also provide a number of social welfare functions, and most recently, for reasons that will soon become apparent, the main function lately is welfare for the aged, the elderly in rural communities. And then there's a whole host of other recreation services, from wedding halls and other gymnasiums, the sale of household goods. We found that there are some co-ops that even sell cars, used cars and tombstones. So it's like a general store in many ways, but a very economically powerful general store. And in being a one-stop shop, particularly in the post-war era when there was little competition, JA throughout that era nearly monopolized farmer business. 100% of farmers in the early post-war period belonged to the co-op. That's still true today. That gave the co-op enormous power in the food supply chain and also gave it clout in the political system. And it leads to a route to market for farmer produce that I depict on the left side of the screen here. Farmers would basically just behave like producers. Most of them were rice farmers. That's still the case. And they would hand over their raw product unprocessed to their local co-op. The co-op would process it minimally and then send it up that JA chain, and eventually it would reach market. So it was a multi-tiered process. And at each tier, make no mistake, commissions were levied that ultimately were paid for by the farmer. Another issue with the co-op system that has been the target of great controversy and criticism is that, unlike Western co-ops, there is an absence in Japan of bottom-up democratic governance. Those national organizations have been extraordinarily powerful and to the detriment of farmer voices. So it's almost an authoritarian system, at least in its heyday, which was the early to mid 1980s, when the amount of produce marketed by JA reached its peak. So we can conclude very briefly that in terms of fulfilling co-op objectives, JA has done pretty well in terms of mitigating farmer risk and representing the farmer in the political or the marketplace, but it hasn't been so effective in terms of lowering production costs and maximizing farmer incomes. So we observe in reference to the post-war era that it seemed that JA organizations were more intent on serving their own narrow economic interests than those of the farmers they represented. And to be sure, many JA organizations became extraordinarily lucrative. So one of the big questions that comes out of all of this that we address in the book, and I'll just touch on it briefly here, is how did JA get this way? Why did it depart from international best practices for all intents and purposes? Well, it has to do with history. That multifunctionality at the local level, the organizational hierarchy, those are all rooted in pre-war precedents that go way back to the early 20th century. And they're also the product of deliberate decisions by the early post-war Japanese government, particularly during the occupation. Now, SCAP, the US occupation forces, if they'd had their way, they would have overseen the implementation of a co-op system that looks more like the United States or European co-op systems, far more localized, decentralized, independent, and certainly more democratic in terms of co-op governance. But instead, I should mention just one other thing, instead the Japanese government made a number of choices to create a more hierarchical top-down system. And that in part reflects the fact that during the occupation era, Japan was very concerned about food scarcity and used the co-op system as an agent of the state for the distribution of rations, particularly rice. And it kept that sort of hierarchy ever since. Of course, there are a number of other supportive economic, political, and policy conditions that help cement this system that were in place throughout the post-war era. The fact that agricultural markets were completely closed, for rice, were completely closed, and prices, especially for rice, were kept artificially high by the government. That certainly helped. The lack of domestic competition certainly helped because of excessive regulation. And then there is that famous JA-LDP electoral exchange relationship in which JA would deliver the farm vote to the Liberal Democratic Party in return for favorable economic policies and protections. This was the relationship that led to the LDP as often being referred to at the heyday of its power as a party of the countryside. Interestingly, though, that for as long as the economy and the economic pie was growing, and farmers, especially small-scale part-time farmers, which by the early 90s were outnumbering full-time farmers by a ratio of 5 to 1, as long as those farmers remained in the middle class, they didn't complain much because their economic pie was also growing. But then things start to change, and the turning point we mark as the collapse of the bubble. It's not that the bubble directly causes what I'm about to talk about, but it certainly exacerbates a number of the trends that had long been percolating and then become more intense in the next subsequent few decades. There were a number of changes from the 1990s that changed the economic context of agricultural cooperation Japanese style. For example, the rice market was partially liberalized in the mid-1990s, and that causes a long-term drop in rice prices. There's been a gradual liberalization of restrictions on land ownership and farm enterprises, which means farms are starting to get bigger. And along with these changes, farms are diversifying their preferences, and their demands on JA organizations are also starting to diversify. The era of what we call the passive producer that simply hands their raw product over to the co-op system is an era of old, and that is beginning to change. Farmers are now more entrepreneurial, and they're expecting more of JA. There's also been a gradual liberalization of the wholesale, processing, and retail markets that affect the food supply chain in Japan, and that means increasing competition for JA. And then finally, and this is by no means a complete list, in 1994, the electoral system was changed in a way that meant farmers' votes mattered less. So the LDP is still supportive of farmers, but not to the same degree as before. And they advocate for farmers now in much different ways that don't necessarily advantage JA. Alongside these economic problems have been a number of demographic crises. The first has been a steady decline in the number of farm households, the family farm. You'll see it decreased from more than 2.5 million in 1995 to just over 1 million a year ago. Much of this is natural. All mature economies experience a decline in their farm households. But this has reached drastic levels, and the problem is that there's no end in sight to this decline. And that reflects in part the second prong of the crisis, and the more intense prong, which is the aging of the farm population. As we like to say, I remember Cade pointing this out to me once, and it's in the book, that Japan is aging faster than any other population in the world, and farmers are aging at a rate much faster than the general population. The average age of farmers as of 2020 is 68 years old. That is the highest in the world. And that finally also reflects, and there are other contributing factors to this, an acute successor crisis. At least 50% of traditional farm households in Japan lack someone to take over the family farm. So JA now faces a challenge. As the graph on the right highlights, it's becoming harder and harder for farmers to earn a decent income, which simply exacerbates the farm successor shortage. You'll see that both farmer and worker households peaked around 1955, and then both have declined. But for the longest time, farm household incomes outpaced that of worker households. That relationship has now been reversed. In response to all of this, and the understanding that if farmers are to secure those all-important successors, farm incomes are going to have to improve, there's a growing consensus amongst stakeholders, including members of JA, but not necessarily all of them, that JA must try harder to adapt to changing market signals and put more money in the pockets of farmers. And if co-ops fail to do this, they know that more market-savvy, competitive farmers may defect away from JA and seek alternative sources of inputs and alternative routes to market. So JA has to change. Those local co-ops need to become more market-oriented after decades of relying on subsidies and protections and basically price gouging their members. Now they need to be more market-savvy in a way that puts more money in the pockets of their farmers, but only some co-ops do this. And so part of the book, we want to explain why is this the case. And to do that, we adopt an institutional perspective, and we focus as our outcome variable, if you will, co-op strategies. And we borrow from business definitions of what strategies are. Strategies for us are a co-op's enforceable action plans or repeated behaviors for maximizing potential returns on their available resources within existing market settings. They can include a whole bunch of things. We focus primarily on the following. They can include efforts to improve farmer productivity by lowering costs, but most importantly through technological innovation and what we have found and will describe today, collective schemes for maximizing production. There are also efforts to enhance product quality. And then more and more co-ops are getting into the branding game, just like any other business, some obviously more successfully than others. So what are the criteria then that will enable us to predict that or will explain why some co-ops will jump into this kind of strategic change and perhaps even do so effectively? Well, we put together a data set of 105 co-ops from 6 prefectures and ran a bunch of numbers. And unfortunately, we found that we could find no really meaningful correlations, with just a few small exceptions between some of the characteristics of co-ops. There was a number of full-time to part-time farmers, older farmers versus younger farmers. A lot of these indicators did not yield significant results. Long story short, We have come to the conclusion as a result of our qualitative research, that field work that Hiroki was talking about earlier, and countless interviews, many of them conducted by Kei, who's been in Japan for much of the last 2 to 3 years. We've concluded from those findings that there are 3 sets of criteria, basically, for a co-op to embark, and let alone effectively embark, on strategic change. And the first has to do with resources. A co-op has to have good natural resource endowments, good soil that's suitable for certain products, good rainfall. If there's too much mountainous land, that's going to be a problem. It's going to raise the cost of production, et cetera, et cetera. It also needs corresponding market opportunities for what it is environmentally primed to produce. That immediately knocks a number of co-ops out of the strategic innovation game, because so many are located in mountainous regions or in areas that have to practice a monoculture, and that makes it very difficult for them to engage in the new kinds of production that will match with market opportunities. So that many co-ops just fall out of innovation as a result of these deficiencies. So assuming that a co-op has decent resources and market opportunities on its horizon, the other set of criteria, conditions that need to be met, have to do with agency. There need to be people in the co-op at various levels that recognize opportunities for reform, who can articulate measures for success, who can implement new ideas and organize farmers behind co-op goals. And we've learned in talking to a number of different kinds of co-ops that sometimes agency will emanate from co-op leaders, as exemplified by the photograph we have here. Here's one of the individuals whom we interviewed in Kumamoto Prefecture, who almost single-handedly transformed one branch of J.A. Kamimashiki into a more successful production machine. And he was so effective at what he did that Prime Minister Abe came by for a visit, as you can see. He has become almost a national sort of poster person for what needs to be done, what kind of leadership needs to be implemented to implement these kinds of change. But we've also found that sometimes agency will come from the members themselves. These are, after all, economic membership organizations. And sometimes it will be entrepreneurial farmers that push the co-op's feet to the fire and force them to innovate. We found in the case of Mr. Kudo, pictured here, that he was almost a one-man show, in part because he oversaw and helped lead many hundreds of farm households that, for all intents and purposes, were passive producers. These were not entrepreneurial farmers with lots of innovative business-like ideas. They had to be pulled behind his ideas. So different co-ops will have different kinds of relationships between their farmers and their co-ops in this regard. And then the third set of conditions that we find must be met in order for co-ops to walk down this path is organizational. Since this is an economic membership organization, co-op strategic change cannot succeed unless the members are behind it. And that involves the agent getting involved in very careful organization, organizing farmers into local production associations, creating channels of communication between those grassroots groups and the co-op themselves, and so on and so forth. The two sides need to be knit together. And that can also often take years, as Mr. Kudo has told us, 20 years or more in some cases. Now, I don't want to suggest that these are necessary and sufficient criteria, simply that they're necessary, but lots more can happen to derail a co-op's efforts to engage in strategic reform. Sometimes, as we'll see, the timing and sequencing of reforms can make all the difference, as we discovered in the case of the branding of rice. Or unforeseen events can happen, which is very natural in agriculture. There can be natural disasters, the elimination of subsidies by the government, or decreasing demand, whether it's due to demographic decline or, as we're learning now in Japan, COVID-19. And that list can go on and on and on. So even though those criteria must be met, many, many more things can happen that will spell success or failure. And this is one of the reasons why strategic reform is so difficult. So moving along, we have 4 case studies divided over 2 chapters in the book, and I want to talk briefly about 2 of them. One, a largely vegetable producing co-op in Nagano Prefecture, and then a rice-centric co-op in Niigata Prefecture. By rice-centric, we mean that the co-op produces more rice by far than any other product. Now, the first case is J.A. Sakuasama, which is in Nagano Prefecture. And J.A. Sakuasama has implemented, along with other co-ops in Nagano, a very interesting strategy known as, in short, as a production adjustment strategy for vegetables in particular. And it has basically 3 sets of steps. First of all, prefecture-wide, JA at the Nagano level establishes a number of standards for quality-related grades, and the prices of those products will vary by grade. Now, here's a picture that Kei took in a local distribution center in JA Sakuasama of lettuce that are literally the size of basketballs. These are the gems of JA Sakuasama's lettuce production, and they have the highest possible grade. Now, to make sure that this these wonderful, beautiful, bright green lettuces secure the best possible prices in the market, first of all, Nagano sets production targets for all of Nagano, and it distributes them across all of the co-ops, and then the co-ops divide the targets amongst the branches, and the branches work with the co-op or the farmer organizations to implement their share of those targets. And then at the end of the harvest, there is sort of a creative destruction that's carried out. If there's an overproduction, farmers will be asked and compensated if they are asked to destroy some of their product. And the aim of this is to destroy only the lower quality products so that will maintain the higher prices of those gems at the top of the price pyramid. It's been remarkably successful. Farmers tend to be reasonably happy with J.A. Sakuasama and other Nagano co-ops, with some exceptions, of course. But there is, I think, a relatively, modest understanding that JA here is working for the benefit of farmers and in a way that at least stabilizes farmer incomes. And lo and behold, they of course meet all of the criteria that we deem necessary for these sorts of successes. They have resources and market opportunities, excellent soil conditions for particularly root vegetables and leafy greens, like we pictured in the previous slide, and strong and in some cases even rising consumer demand across Japan for these these vegetables in general and for high quality vegetables that Nagano produces. There's also excellent agency, and it worked in a way that surprised us. Those targets that are prefecture-wide are actually set by Zenno, the national JA organization, and in a way that's fairly effective. Zenno sets the targets, and then there's cooperation at the co-op and branch level with those entrepreneurial farmers. So Zenno sets the targets, and those entrepreneurial farmers who are organized in mandatory local production associations, they also put pressure on the JA, to the local co-op, to do as much as they can to keep prices high and to serve those farmers. And there's mutual monitoring we found amongst the co-ops, the farmers, and also Zenno at the top. A second co-op, and I'm looking at just the winners here. The second co-op that we look at is in Niigata Prefecture. And all co-ops that are rice-centric face a number of challenges today. Like other co-ops, all rice-centric co-ops must adapt their strategies to freer price signals and increasing private sector competition if they are to survive. But rice, we found, has special needs. And that's because the demand for rice is steadily shrinking. In fact, it has been cut in half between the early 1960s and today. And this means that with declining demand and declining prices that feed off each other, even the most hardworking rice-centric co-ops that meet all of our criteria may fail to increase or even stabilize farmer incomes. And we've learned and identified that these sorts of farmers find that they have three very rice-specific strategies to pursue in order to do as well as they possibly can. They can diversify away from rice by producing vegetables or fruits or going into livestock, etc. They can diversify within rice rather than just produce household rice for high-end restaurants and families. They can also produce food, rice, that's known as business rice, for food processors and retail restaurant chains, or even rice for feed for livestock. And then the other strategy, which is sort of like the gold standard for all really successful co-ops, is to brand the co-op's best rice. And I want to talk a little bit about branding in what may very well be Japan's most famous rice producing co-op. This is JA Minami Uonuma in Niigata Prefecture. And they don't practice the other two strategies on that rice-centric menu of choices. No need to diversify away or within from rice. They are all about high-end, mostly high-end koshihikari household rice and branding it very, very effectively. And they do so by meeting those three criteria. Again, they have extraordinary soil and climatic conditions, relatively flat land on which to grow their high-end rice. And the result is Japan's highest priced koshihikari rice. And the bag is pictured right here. They also have strong proactive co-op leadership and close ties, very similar to what we talked about with some modification, to their farmer members through special organizations. But we also discovered that co-ops that are rice-centric, that are successful, like JA Minami Uonuma, also go one step further on agency, for example. Whereas most co-ops are led by farmers themselves, JA Minami Uonuma has a number of experts in their board of directors and other managing organizations that probably have MBAs or the equivalent, at least a lot of experience in marketing, some department store marketing and other venues that are outside of agriculture. So they're borrowing from the broader business community to learn best practices and apply them in innovative ways to the marketing of rice. And we also found that timing is key in rice-centric co-ops. The fact that JA Minami Uonuma was the first out of the gate to brand its rice several decades ago is probably the reason why it today secures the highest prices by far of any other branded rice. They were first past the post and they have that first mover advantage. So if you are lucky enough to fly first class or business class on JAL rather, Japan Airlines, you have sampled this koshihikari. It's one of their marketing ploys. Those passengers now get served their best rice on their meal trays. If you're in coach, you get the cheaper stuff. Now, that in a nutshell are some of the things we try to do in this book, but let me just give you a few other sort of takeaways and some other unspoken, I think, questions that I may have raised but never answered that may lead us into a broader discussion. The first is a surprise to us. We used to think about JA and the co-ops and farmers as cookie cutter. Everybody did the same thing. Remarkable degree of isomorphism amongst the JA organizations, all doing the same thing in lockstep with one another. It's not true. Every co-op is different. Strategically, organizationally, even the mindsets of farmers and the co-op personnel, all different. And we also found that, of course, many co-ops are failing. They're failing in many different ways, but those that are successful really stand out in the ways in which they are distinctive. We're also want to point out that, as I've like to say in various venues, because we anticipate this critique, we're not writing a neoliberal screed and saying that the future is farming is to follow neoliberal industrialized agriculture. That's not the case at all. And in our book, we do highlight that co-ops are also social organizations that perform a number of necessary functions for their communities, everything from maintaining irrigation systems to providing social services to communities. that may be lacking in alternative providers. It just so happens that JA takes things to the nth degree in that regard. But the fact that this social function is so important to co-ops in general and JA organizations in particular, I think must be kept in mind. And it's one reason why these functions can be costly and I think contribute to the reasons why some co-ops fail to innovate significantly from a more market-oriented perspective. We also learned that there are good subsidies and bad subsidies. Critics like to say Japan is overly subsidized its agricultural sector, and they're right to a degree. But we've also found that a lot of the innovation we've seen in not just the co-ops we've mentioned to you today, but others that are in our book and not in our book, there are good subsidies as well. If the government provides a subsidy in the right way, it serves the same function as a free market signal. Also want to point out, we recognize that these winning strategies don't always speak to sustainability concerns, which is really a 21st century issue that we all must pay attention to. Our food supply system relies too heavily on pesticides, mass production, et cetera. And certainly in terms of chemical inputs into the production process, Japan stands amongst some of the top offenders in that regard. This is actually an area that interests Kay and I now that we're looking into. We don't address it too much in the book, but we know it's very much a major issue. And then to conclude, another thing I didn't talk about today, but it gets a whole chapter in the book, is the government of Japan, including under Prime Minister Abe, who came across as a major agricultural reformer, government of Japan is often critiqued for not doing enough to reform or create the conditions for more competitive, prosperous agriculture. And that's true to a point. Abe managed to implement some modest but significant reforms to the JA system in 2015 that have been a positive step forward, but critics are right when they say it's not enough. A lot more needs to be done to save Japan from its economic and demographic foundations of that agricultural crisis. But we also want to point out, and we recognize and we build this into the book, that there have been years and years of small-scale salami sliced changes to the conditions of agriculture and the way agriculture itself has been implemented over the years. And the cumulative effects of those years of small-scale reforms have unleashed some really interesting local incentives for further reform that we argue are likely to intensify regardless of levels of future government engagement in Japanese agriculture. And I think with that, I'll stop, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I have many things that I would like to discuss, but if you have any question or anything that you want to discuss, please write them in the Q&A box, and I will incorporate them into our discussion as much as possible. If I couldn't pick them up, I apologize. I may not be able to pick up all of the questions. So let's start with our mutual friends and also the colleague of Japanese studies, Diana Newton. She asked the question of, well, so is Japan headed towards the large commercial farms like the United States? Because the successor crisis is created by demographics. I'd like to add a question to this. So to me, like an answer seems to be not likely. And one reason is, of course, regulation. In my understanding, Japanese, the private sector, private corporations cannot enter the agribusiness under the current law, although that is somehow alleviated recently. So I think it's very difficult. That's why Japan is unlikely to head toward the large commercial farms and agribusinesses like the United States. But at the same time, there is a certain need, and then also it economically makes sense given the current demographic conditions. So what I'd like to add is, so when I talked about this with some of the reformists, like Professor Heizo Takenaka, and then like, they point out, well, because of aging, old people tend not to invest. Therefore, Japanese agriculture does not head toward large commercial farms. But at the same time, because farmers do not invest, that's why young people are not attracted with farming, right? So it's actually kind of like which one should come first, and then there seems to be a kind of vicious cycle between lack of investment and then it cannot become a large scale, because like a not large scale, just small scale, so not attractive for young people. So there seems to be a very like kind of a vicious cycle. So where should we start if we want to like move toward a better direction of Japanese agriculture? So could you
Sure.
let's discuss this issue first.
Okay, yeah, that's a really interesting set of questions, and one that we talk about a lot, Kay and I. And in response to Diana's question, and I'm so glad that Diana's here, it is true that large commercial farms, large agribusinesses are few and far between in Japan. There are a few that are more regionally based, but they're nowhere near on the scale of large businesses that we associate with agribusiness in the United States. There are no Cargills or Tysons in Japan. And you're right, it's not likely that will ever happen, in part because of regulation. But regulation, as you note, Hiroki, has really been liberalized to a significant degree. Not enough, but to the point where the average size farm has increased from 1 hectare 20 years ago, that's about 2.5 acres, to 2 hectares today, just a little over 2 hectares. And there are more and more full-time the portion of full-time farmers to part-time farmers is increasing. But when all is said and done, I think even if there's full deregulation of Japanese farming, and who gets to farm, we'll never see the scale of agribusinesses. And that's partly geographic. There are too many impediments to land agglomeration in Japan that are natural. There is no equivalent of the Great Plains. Well, there are some plains within Japan that are prime agricultural land, but they're very small proportion in Japan. So those geographic impediments are important. There are cultural impediments to this. There's still an allergy toward non-farm household commercial ventures getting involved in agriculture. That said, changes to the Japanese agricultural land law in 2009 have enabled commercial ventures that aren't traditional farm households to get involved in agriculture through leasing of land. They're not allowed to own the land, but they can lease the land. And as a result, supermarket chains and kombini are renting land, and those are just 2 examples. They're renting land and farming directly, which bypasses JA, not coincidentally. And so, the agriculture is far more diverse, but because of that regulation, which is slow to change, we see a level of diversity, but I think it's still safe to say that the family farm will prevail for far longer within Japan than it has in other countries, particularly agricultural export superpowers. I want to address Dr. Takenaka's idea. That was kind of interesting, that because of aging, the old don't invest, and that partly explains the lack of, movement away from the family farm. It's almost tautological to me. Why should anybody invest in a family farm? So I don't think that's the main reason. I think the main reason why farmers are having trouble finding successors is that vicious cycle for rice of declining demand due to aging and the diversifying diets of the Japanese, declining demand due to aging, and then the liberalization of the of the rice market. So for rice farmers, it's a double-edged sword, really, or not a double-edged sword, it's a mixed blessing, I think would be a good way to talk about it. Liberalization enables the farmers to do new things and for new people to get involved in farm production. But those declining prices due to declining demand make farming less of a lucrative business, and they're driving ordinary or new farmers from coming into the field to taking up farming. So it's a very complex issue, but the bottom line is I don't ever foresee in my lifetime major agribusinesses or even really large for Japan commercial agriculture taking root. It will always be, to a degree, a agricultural system of small scale family farming.
Actually, interestingly, in Japan, like not only there is no big agribusiness corporation, but also food companies are also relatively small compared with giant food companies in the United States. So that's actually that maybe like because of like a lack of like a big large scale agriculture, and then as a result, you know, it leads to a lack of big food company.
Can I say something to that?
Yeah,
You know,
yes.
what's really interesting to us, we talk about how farmers are moving down the food supply chain. They're not just producers, but some of them are getting involved in processing and even selling their own product. And they bypass JA this way. And the reverse is true as well. The liberalization of the large scale retail store law, for example, liberalization of rice vending, the liberalization of food processing enables those kinds of sectors to move into production through the leasing of land. So we see far more integration up and down, down upstream and downstream. And that's really important. But as of now, Kay and I have visited some interesting food firms, a soy sauce factory, for example, that in Kumamoto Prefecture that begins as a processor and now has direct ties to their producers and retails their own soy sauce, does some of the retailing itself. That's very interesting. And we find, although some of them have a national reach, many of them are geared towards serving certain regions, which from the perspective of industrial agriculture is not competitive, but from the perspective of sustainable agriculture, that's a good thing. Sustainable agriculture requires production for localities. And so Japan actually does that better, maybe because it missed the boat in large scale commercialized, industrialized, mass production agriculture. Maybe that what used to be its advantage and then was looked as an impediment, maybe it can be an advantage again when it comes to creating a system of more sustainable food production.
I think that you answer the question that I was going to ask, but let me reiterate that question, and then you may want to add. So Jacob Muse, our student, asks, so Japan is a very small island. Well, not necessarily. Actually, Japan is, I think, the 25th largest country in the world in terms of landmass. Well, it's quite mountainous, so not suitable for large-scale agriculture.
Yeah.
Well, of course, you know, if you compare with the United States, yes, Japan is a very small island, and then that determines the very different conditions of for agriculture, especially compared with the United States. But you know, very similar to other, like similar to many European countries, for example. But anyway, so he asked, so this has an effect on the effectiveness of crops. So not only effectiveness of agriculture, but also efficiency of agriculture, but also effectiveness of crops. I think that, you know, your answer is probably there is a variation, but at the same time, I think that this leads to Japanese farmers, especially successful farmers, more for high-end products. I think that's actually the case. And then, you know, Kiri McNamee, actually, who read your manuscript, asked the question of. So, you know, you just talked about this, but could you talk again about whether the sustainability of Japanese agriculture and current trends. And it seems like a trend is a little bit like coming back. Aging has stopped, and some promising innovative entrepreneurial farmers. Could you talk about the sustainability of Japanese agriculture and current trends given the geographic conditions?
Yeah, I'd also like to and talk to that earlier comment about Japan being very mountainous, and that affects co-ops. And I mentioned there in 2018, there were 652 local co-ops. Now it's 500 and something. And these co-ops keep merging. So co-ops today are pretty large. And in each co-op, you can have many ecosystems, many agricultural opportunities in terms of natural resources. And that's made it hard for Kay and I basically to do this project. We found that there's variation even within the co-ops amongst co-op branches. But that, yes, of course, that can be a real impediment to farmers and to co-ops. Agricultural production is simply much more expensive and more limited when it's in a high altitude terrain. But the other word that sort of comes out in my thinking about this is successful farmers. Does that mean they produce high-end products? Not necessarily. I think the case is more producing for niche markets. Consumers are more pickier and pickier, and they know what kind of rice they want. They know what kind of vegetables they want, what price point they want to pay. And the farmers now have more choice and the co-ops have more choice to produce for those niche parts of markets. So Japanese farmers and the co-ops and agribusinesses, smaller scale, are getting better at producing for specialized consumer demand. And as for sustainability, that's hard to achieve if farmers are all working within JA, because JA makes so much of its money from the sale of chemical pesticides, fertilizers, and the lot. JA knows that consumers don't want that. It's hard to go organic. Organic's expensive. Organic takes up more land. It takes up more time on the part of the farmer who has to weed by hand. Organic means higher prices for consumers. It's not necessarily more profitable. But what JA has done to toot that sustainability horn is, in many co-ops, start to market products that use lower levels of chemical additives, not necessarily chemical free. But we found that even in Nagano, in the co-op that I talked about, that efforts by the co-op to control the quality and hence prices of those lettuce heads and other vegetables, it requires a great deal of unified participation by the farmers. The farmers have to belong in these specialized production associations at the local level, and they must agree to buy the requisite number of chemicals and use it on their fields in order to produce that perfect head of lettuce. So sustainability will be a challenge in terms of environmental, less use of additives or chemical inputs. But there's a whole other story to be told. Japan is really innovating, and this is where Kay and I are having conversations now into hydroponic production. In other words, growing foods in special greenhouses, just using water, carefully regulated water, and vertical production, in which there are tiers of produce, and in hermetically sealed environmental bubbles, basically, that keep out the pests, so you don't need to use pesticides. So this is a global trend, and Japan is very interested in it. And I think that's something that will be really interesting to see going forward.
Yeah, one thing that suggests the future of Japanese agriculture is, when we take our students to Japan in SME Japan program, what they are very impressed is food. So that's actually, I also miss it so much. No. I think yes, Japanese agriculture is not efficient, but that's why that successful farmers are producing high-end products, and then the quality is very high. And then I think that's actually the future of Japanese agriculture. So my question, actually, this is the last question to conclude our discussion, is so you actually ended your presentation with suggesting that actually there are good subsidies and bad subsidies. So it means that there is a good agricultural policy and bad agricultural policy. So what is your policy suggestion for Japanese government? Actually, Prime Minister Kishida has been inaugurated, and then the next, so that now Japan has a general election, and then, most likely, so we are both political scientists, so we do some like a prediction for the election, but most likely, Prime Minister Kishida will continue to be a prime minister. And so if you have an opportunity to give a policy suggestion to Prime Minister Kishida, what would you give?
That's a really good question. And, Kate wrote to me this afternoon, and I haven't had a chance to read it, that apparently the LDP manifesto has a whole bunch of things to say about agriculture. I don't think we'll put it somewhere eventually, but she said it's almost like an industrial policy for agriculture. So it's still an issue. But let me give you in closing an example what I think is a bad subsidy, and then what I wish there were more subsidies for. And the bad subsidy is an extraordinary set of subsidies for the production of feed rice, which is unsustainable. It doesn't contribute to sustainability, let's put it that way. It's using up precious land for the production of rice that are going to be eaten by cows and chickens and pigs. And a lot of farmers that were struggling now get these incredible subsidies, and it prevents those farmers from diversifying away from rice or diversifying within rice. So that, I think, is a bad subsidy. It gets a ton of critiques, rightly so. I think there's a political reason for it. It prevents farmers from taking the risk of diversifying, and that does serve a political and electoral purpose, of course. But where I think we would all like to see more subsidies is to ease Japanese exports of food, and not mass-produced food, but this precisely the kind of high-quality food we spoke about that speaks to niche markets. Consumers in Hong Kong and Beijing, particularly wealthier ones, and throughout Southeast Asia, want to eat Japanese rice. And there's an opportunity to do that, but it's hard to sell abroad. There are barriers to trade, and the Japanese government hasn't done a whole lot to bring those barriers down through negotiations. And I think although they've made great strides toward this, there's still more that can be done to provide really carefully calibrated kinds of subsidies to farmers that seek through whatever channel to help them with those channels to send their best produce abroad, probably within Asia. Now, this makes a lot of sense. A lot of people who are listening here know that Japan has UNESCO. Its food is a culturally significant site for UNESCO. And yet when you go to a Japanese restaurant in the United States, your rice is made in California. And a lot of the stuff comes from sites around the United States instead of Japan. It would be nice to eat Japanese food that's made in Japan if we're going to be really serious about our niche consumption. So there is a demand for Japanese food, but Japan has priced itself out of these markets. So I think another thing that Japan needs to do is find a way to make Japanese products more successful, more accessible to a wider variety of consumers abroad.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I would like to take one more question that is, to conclude. Ken Amano, graduate student of University of Washington, asks, what are you interested in for future research? Now you have worked on post office, consumers, and then now NJA. So
if I say, then I have to peg myself to it. I told you about it yesterday, Hiroki. Okay, it's a bit of a secret, but I will divulge it here. Kay and I still have some papers that we would like to write on Japanese agriculture. We still have something, there's still so much more to say. And so we're continuing our collaboration. So we'll remain on the subject for some time, I think. And there are other things that I'm thinking about social welfare, Japanese style. But as I told Hiroki yesterday, and Kay doesn't know this yet, but eventually I'm going to start working on pianos and the political economy of pianos, how pianos are produced and how piano production has moved from Europe to the United States to Japan, Korea, and now China. So I want to do a multi-country study of not only the manufacturing of pianos, but the sociology of pianos, the culture. So pianos will be like the intersection of economics, industrial policy, the arts, and certainly the rise of the middle class around these countries. So that's probably a few years away, but I think of that as my vanity project that will take me well past retirement.
Well, that's
now the word's out.
Well, that's actually a wonderful topic. So that's why I wanted to hear from you. And then also I wanted our audience to hear. So I'm looking forward to your works.
You'll be old when that one comes out, Hiroki. We all love you.
Well, thank you very much, all of you who attended our discussion, and also thank you for especially those who are participating in our discussion, raising the questions. They're so excellent. Thank you very much, Patty, for sharing your work. So it was very stimulating. This is very interesting topic. So please join me for thanking Dr. Patricia McLachlan.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure. I really enjoyed being here. And since I didn't have a chance to meet many of the people in the audience, if there are questions that are unanswered, I'm happy to answer them over email. So I'm at University of Texas. I'm easy to find. So thank you everyone for attending. And again, thank you for this invitation.
Right, thank you. Have a nice evening or have a nice day, depending on where you are. Yeah. And looking forward to seeing you all virtually soon. Thank you.
Thank you.